Aegis Station existed in a pocket of deliberately empty space, a sterile, gray polygon adrift in a star-dusted void. Its official designation was Xenobiological Research, a benign title for a facility that operated with the severe, humorless efficiency of a black-site prison. Within its polished, antiseptic corridors, low-level technicians like Kale were just another part of the machinery, as interchangeable as a biofilter. He wasn't a soldier or a corporate executive. He was a junior biologist with an overabundance of empathy, a quality considered a critical liability on Aegis. His days were a monotonous loop of monitoring vital sign feeds, calibrating atmospheric scrubbers and cleaning containment units, all while studiously avoiding the gazes of the armed, black-clad security teams. His rounds always ended at the station's dark heart, the Obsidian Cell. It sat apart from the other labs, a 20-meter-wide block of quad-reinforced transparent steel and energy-dampening field emitters, surrounded by a stark white dead zone, where no one was permitted to stand. Inside was Subject Zero, the station's most expensive and spectacular failure. Kale had never seen the creature, not really. No one did unless they were reviewing the failure logs. Subject Zero was a legend defined by its victims. The first attempt at mastery had been a Zorg warlord, a creature of pure domineering will who had entered the cell armed with an energy whip and boundless arrogance. The logs showed the whip's braided plasma cord being snapped like thread, followed by a blur of shadow and a final, wet static. The second was a Tellan mind melder, a specialist in telepathic subjugation. The Tellan had lasted 9 seconds before recoiling, screaming, its mind shattered by a psychic counterassault of pure, primal agony. It now resided, catatonic, in the station's medbay. The final attempt, a corporate security team armed with shock prods and deprivation tactics, had ended in a bloodbath the moment the creature, which had been playing dead, had decided to move. Now, Subject Zero was just a line item on a termination schedule, a failed asset too volatile to study and too dangerous to move. Kale's shift supervisor, a grim-faced man named Hark, had assigned him a menial after-hours task, running a deep-level diagnostic scan on the cell's exterior life support conduits. It was grunt work, but it put Kale alone in the cavernous, low-lit chamber, separated from the galaxy's most efficient killer by 4 inches of steel and an energy field. He powered up the scanner, its quiet hum lost in the thrum of the station. And then he saw it. Not on a blurry video feed but present. It moved from the shadows at the back of the cell, and the light seemed to dim around it. Subject Zero was a Kthran, a 6-limbed predator of midnight black fur that seemed to drink the light. It was magnificent, a perfect synthesis of muscle and shadow, its body built for a terrible, lethal grace. But as it paced, Kale, the biologist, noticed what the soldiers and telepaths had missed. It limped. The creature's gait was uneven, a slight but agonizing hitch in its left hind leg. Kale moved closer, peering past the scanner. There, just above the Kthranus' massive paw, was a ragged, festering wound. A crude shackle burn, inflamed and weeping, had been left to rot. Kale glanced at the cell's automated medspray nozzles. They were calibrated for bipedal physiology, misting 2 meters above the floor, completely missing the infected limb. He looked at his scanner, which was passively picking up the creature's telemetry. The station's analyst saw the spikes in adrenaline and cortisol and labeled it unprovoked aggression. Kale saw the truth. He cross-referenced the limp with the constant, frenetic spikes in the vitals. It wasn't rage. It was agony. The untamable predator wasn't lashing out because it was a monster. It was lashing out because it was in constant, blinding pain. The following rotation, the sterile air of Aegis Station felt colder, more suffocating. Kale's realization about the Kthran had shifted from a diagnostic observation to a moral imperative, a weight that settled heavily in his chest. His new understanding was confirmed when he passed Warden Hesk in a primary corridor. Hesk, a man whose pragmatism was a physical aura of cold calculation, was flanked by 2 corporate-sponsored bioethicists. "The asset is a total loss," Hesk was saying, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's a shame, but the volatility is a contamination risk. I've signed the termination order. Euthanize Subject Zero. Flood the cell with X7 corrosive nerve agent at 2200 hours. The word struck Kale like a physical blow. 2200 hours? He had less than 12 hours. The cleanse protocol was designed for maximum efficiency, a brutal chemical fire that would dissolve the creature from the inside out. It was a death of unimaginable, protracted agony, and it was reserved for the station's most terrifying mistake. All evening, Cale felt the seconds ticking away, each one a hammerfall on his conscience. He saw the Cthranus limping pace in his mind, the festering wound, the intelligent, pain-filled eyes. He couldn't just let it happen. To stand by was to be complicit in the torture. This wasn't a calculated plan, it was a desperate, singular act of defiance. For the next 2 hours, Cale moved through the station like a ghost, committing what amounted to high treason against the corporation. He used his techpad to borrow supplies, his low-level access just high-grade enough to be dangerous. From the med bay, he acquired a tube of broad-spectrum anesthetic gel, military-grade antibiotic spray, and a laser suture. From the commissary, he diverted a pouch of Ration Pack 4, a nutrient-dense, savory meat paste intended for high-gravity acclimation. He knew the inventory system would flag the discrepancies. He knew that if he was caught, he wouldn't just be fired. He would be disappeared to a re-education colony, a fate worse than imprisonment. At 21:40, 20 minutes before the purge, he stood before the obsidian cell. The chamber was silent, the lights dimmed for the night cycle. Cale used his credentials to override the night shift lockdown and cycle the main airlock. The hiss of the door was deafening. He stepped inside, not with a weapon, not with a shock prod, but with a medkit in one hand and a food pouch in the other. He felt the static charge of the energy field as it powered down. The inner door, the final barrier of transparent steel, slid open with a hydraulic sigh. Vex, as Cale had begun to call it in his mind, was on its feet instantly, a 400-kilo shadow of vibrating rage. A low growl emanated from its chest, a sound so deep it shook Cale's bones and rattled his teeth. The Cthranus mind lashed out, a psychic wave of pure, unfiltered pain threat kill that slammed into Cale's consciousness, forcing him to his knees. But Cale didn't flinch or run. He just winced, his head bowed. "I know," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not here to hurt you." He made himself small, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor 15 meters from the predator, just outside its perceived kill zone. Vex snarled, displaying serrated fangs, but it didn't charge. It just watched, its burning ember eyes tracking this soft, strange creature who had willingly entered its cage. Slowly, Cale unsealed the ration pack and rolled it gently across the floor. The savory, metallic scent of the food filled the cell. Vex hissed, its focus shifting to the pouch, but it didn't move. Then Cale held up the silver tube of anesthetic gel. He didn't point it at Vex. He squeezed a tiny amount onto his own arm, rubbing it in to show it was harmless. He slid the applicator across the floor, just a few feet from the food. "This will help the pain," he said. Vex looked at the food. It looked at the medicine. And then, for a long, breathless minute, it looked at Cale. It saw no dominance, no malice, no intent to conquer. It saw only a small, breakable thing offering aid. The apex predator, who had shattered minds and torn men apart, took one limping, hesitant step forward. It nudged the med applicator with its nose, then nudged it back toward Cale, a clear, unmistakable gesture. It was an invitation. Help. Cale's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden, heavy silence. The invitation was terrifying, an act of trust so profound it felt like a trap. He shuffled forward on his knees, every instinct screaming to flee. "Okay," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Okay, I'm going to help." Vex did not growl, but its entire 400-kilo frame trembled, a vibration of contained power and agony. Cale, his hands shaking, uncapped the anesthetic gel. The predator flinched as the cold gel touched its inflamed skin, a low rumble beginning in its chest, but it held still. Cale worked with a desperate, focused speed, cleaning the septic, weeping wound, the stench of infection sharp and metallic. He sprayed the antibiotic sealant and, finally, used the laser suture to seal the ragged edges of the flesh. The whole time Vex's hot breath gusted against his face, its psychic presence a confusing, roiling mix of pain relief stranger clothes hurt. He finished and scrambled back, his hands covered in a dark, viscous fluid. Vex took a cautious step on the wounded leg, tested it, and then let out a low, protracted huff. The spike of agony in its vitals, a constant red line on Cale's remote feed, suddenly stabilized. Relief was palpable in the air. Cale glanced at his techpad. 21:51. 9 minutes until the purge. "Oh gods," he breathed. He had to stop the protocol, but the terminal was outside. He backed toward the airlock and the inner door slid shut, sealing him off. Vex watched him go, those ember eyes no longer filled with primal rage, but with a new, sharp, and unsettling curiosity. Kale burst through the outer airlock, sprinting to the main corridor control panel. He slammed his palm on the screen, input his credentials, and navigated to the environmental controls. Protocol X7. Abort. Authorization, Kale J42. The terminal flashed a stark, red message, access denied. Warden level approval required. He tried again, his fingers fumbling. No, no, no. A heavy, metallic thud of a boot on the deck echoed from behind him. Freeze tech. Kale's blood turned to ice. He turned slowly. Warden Hesk stood there, flanked by two heavily armed security guards, his face a mask of pure, cold fury. You are in violation of so many regulations, son. Hesk's voice was dangerously soft. I don't even know where to begin. Kale's tech pad chimed. 2156. Sir, please, you have to stop the purge. The asset isn't aggressive, it's in pain. I was just in there. I treated it. Hesk actually laughed, a dry, humorless bark. You what? You went inside? You suicidal idiot. He nodded to the guards. Take him to the brig. I'll deal with him after the cleanse. As the guards surged forward, Kale yelled, No. Just look at the feed. Hesk, annoyed, tapped his own command pad to bring up the live feed from the obsidian cell, no doubt expecting to see the creature hurling itself at the walls. He stopped. The guards stopped, their rifles momentarily forgotten. The high-definition feed showed Subject 0. It was not raging. It had just finished the ration pack. Now it was sitting on its haunches, calmly, gently, cleaning its newly sutured leg. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a creature in a state of placid contentment. Hesk's eyes widened, not with compassion but with a sudden, sharp avarice. The gears of calculation turned visibly behind his eyes. A total loss, asset now, come. He glanced at his console. 2159. With a few swift, decisive taps, he entered his own code. Protocol X7. Hold. Authorization, HISC W01. The red blinking purge light on the wall terminal switched to a steady, hopeful green hold. Hesk looked at Kale, his expression unreadable. You're not going to the brig, tech. You're reassigned. Effective immediately. He gestured to the cell. You are the new official handler. Your only job is to figure out that. And Kale? Kale nodded, trembling with adrenaline. You didn't save its life, Hesk said, his voice a blade. You just made it profitable again. Fail, and you'll be in there with it when I finally sign the order. The next rotation, Kale's life changed. His new job was simply to exist near Vex. The bond, however, was no longer one-sided. The defensive telepathic screams were gone. In their place, Kale received impressions. Soft like watercolors. Hunger. Itch on the healing wound. Curious. Content. A week later, Kale brought a simple, worn high-density rubber ball from his quarters. Vex, whose toys had been shock prots, just stared at the blue orb. Kale tossed it against the far wall. It made a satisfying thwack and bounced back. Vex moved in a blur of shadow, not with claws, but with its broad head, nudging the ball. It rolled back, stopping precisely at Kale's feet. Kale stared. He tossed it again. Vex nudged it back. This wasn't training. It was play. A behavior the xenobiologists had deemed structurally impossible for this species. It was a new language, and Kale was the only one who could speak it. The next 3 weeks redefined Kale's existence. He was moved from his shared barracks to a private observation suite overlooking the obsidian cell. His life became a singular feedback loop. Kale and Vex. The rubber ball had been followed by a reinforced polymer ring, which Vex, whose name Kale now used openly, would fetch with an almost playful eagerness. The psychic link, once a torrent of pain, had settled into a quiet, constant stream. Kale didn't just get impressions of hunger or contentment anymore. He received complex, abstract concepts. He felt Vex's deep, instinctual curiosity about the star-dusted void visible through the cell's single reinforced port. He felt Vex's muted, aching loneliness, a sorrow so profound it had no human equivalent. And Vex, in turn, began to understand Kale. It could sense his fatigue, his frustration, and, most potently, his bone-deep fear of Warden Hesk. This growing harmony, however, was a resource to be exploited. Hesk, having proven the asset's viability, was now under immense pressure from corporate to demonstrate its value. Docility is a parlor trick, Cale, Hesk had sneered during a review, his face a cold, pixelated mask on Cale's wall screen. They didn't spend 50 million credits for a pet. They want a weapon. They want to see control. Cale's stomach had turned to acid. It's not control, sir. It's a relationship. It's trust. Hesk's eyes had narrowed. Then your relationship is about to be put to the test. A transport is arriving tomorrow with a delegation from NSYT Armaments. You will provide a demonstration of this trust. The delegation arrived not as people but as a cold, red, unblinking sensor eye, a live-feed camera mounted on a tripod in the observation gallery. Cale felt its sterile gaze from above as he stood at the airlock. Hesk's voice crackled over the intercom, flat and devoid of warmth. Standard target acquisition and recall test, Cale. We are sending in an RS-100 combat drone. You will instruct the asset to engage. Then, crucially, you will instruct it to disengage on your command. Do not fail. Cale looked at the drone as it was wheeled into the dead zone, a gleaming black steel human silhouette built to withstand small arms fire. Cale's hands were slick with sweat as he cycled the inner door. Vex was immediately on its feet, a low, inquisitive thrum vibrating from its chest. It nudged Cale's hand, the telepathic query clear. Fearsick why? Cale wanted to run to tell them it was all a lie, that Vex was a person, not a thing. But he couldn't. He looked at Vex and tried to project calm, but his mind was a storm of terror. I'm sorry, he whispered. Please just play. The main bay door on the far side of the cell hissed open, and the RS-100 drone clanked inside. It was inert, but its presence was an intrusion. Vex instantly tensed, its body coiling, its gaze shifting from Cale to the metal man. Strange cold wrong. Engage, Cale, Hesk's voice commanded, an impatient stab of sound. Cale, desperate, pointed a shaking finger at the drone. Okay, Vex. Get it? Get the toy. Vex looked at him, confused. This is not play. Please, Cale begged. To Vex, the situation was dangerously incoherent. Cale's crippling fear, the intruder, the command. He chose to trust Cale. In a movement so fast it was less a charge and more a localized teleportation of shadow, Vex hit the drone. It was not play. It was a focused, professional, and terrifying act of dismantlement. 4-inch thick steel plating was shorn off like paper. The drone's reinforced cranium was torn from its torso and hurled against the far wall with a deafening clang. In 5 seconds, the 50,000 credit drone was a pile of ruined, smoking scrap. A heavy silence filled the chamber. Vex, its adrenaline high, shook its massive head and padded back to Cale's side, nudging him again. Threat gone safe now? Cale stared at the wreckage, his heart pounding. Good boy. Magnificent, Hesk's voice purred over the intercom, laced with a new, terrifying excitement. Now Cale. The recall. Order it to its rest spot. Cale gestured to the corner of the cell. Okay, Vex. Go to your spot. It's over. But Vex didn't move. It was no longer looking at the scrap heap. It was staring, its head tilted, directly at the observation gallery. At the cold red eye of the camera. At the glass where Hesk stood. Vex's psychic presence, once a quiet stream, suddenly sharpened, coalescing with Cale's own fear. It recognized the source of Cale's terror. It wasn't the drone. It was the voice. It was the man outside. Vex let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound Cale had not heard since that first night. It stepped in front of Cale, a 400-kilo shield, and its psychic message was no longer a question. It was a statement, a protective, possessive, and utterly chilling proclamation. Mine. The psychic declaration, mine, hung in the air, a possessive, territorial claim that was not meant for Cale, but for the man behind the glass. Vex's hot, protective breath ghosted over Cale's neck as the creature stood, an immovable shield of shadow and muscle, its ember eyes locked on the observation gallery. Over the intercom, Hesk's voice was no longer purring. It was a razor edge of fury. Negative asset. Stand down. He was speaking to Vex as if it were a disobedient machine. Cale. Recall your pet. Now. Cale, his blood turning to ice, raised a shaking hand. "Vex, please. It's okay. Stand down." But Vex did not move. It was psychically sifting through Kale's own mind, pulling on his fear, his adrenaline, his loathing of the warden. It had found the source of its partner's pain, and it would not look away. So, Hesk's voice was dangerously quiet. The red camera eye swiveled, focusing intently. "It's imprinted then. A fatal design flaw." Kale saw Hesk's hand move on his control panel in the gallery above. Shame. It was almost perfect. A high-frequency whine, barely audible, began to fill the cell. Kale's TechPad chimed with an alert. "Station security. Unauthorized sonic pulse activated cell 01. It was the disciplinary tool, the ultrasonic agony field used to break the creature in the first place. Before Kale could scream a warning, the frequency peaked. The effect was instantaneous. Vex roared, a shriek of pure, unadulterated torment that was not sound, but a psychic blast. The creature's powerful muscles locked, its claws digging into the steel floor as it fought to stay upright. But Kale's world exploded in the same, sympathetic fire. The telepathic link, never meant for this, transmitted Vex's agony directly into his skull. He collapsed, his own scream tearing from his throat, clutching his head as white-hot needles seemed to pierce his brain. He was Vex and Vex was him, and they were both burning. Through the watery, pain-filled haze, Kale looked up. He could see Hesk in the gallery watching the scene, his face a mask of cold, clinical satisfaction. He was pleased. This, Kale realized, was Hesk's solution: sever the bond by destroying the handler. He would torture them both until Kale's mind broke or Vex tore him apart in a fit of transferred agony. In that moment of shared, unbearable torment, Vex's furious, pain-maddened thoughts slammed into Kale's. "Hurts, Kale, hurts, stop him now." Vex wasn't just in pain, it was enraged that its partner was being harmed. That was Hesk's fatal mistake. He thought he was torturing a beast. He was torturing a guardian. And he had given Kale, the broken tech, a reason to fight back. Kale, on his hands and knees, his vision tunneling, fumbled for his tech pad. His fingers, clumsy with phantom pain, flew across the interface. He wasn't a handler. He was a systems technician. He knew the station's bones. He couldn't stop the pulse. Hesk's control was absolute, but he could, with one authorization code, create a much bigger problem. He bypassed 2 security holds and slammed his thumb on a digital trigger. Emergency protocol, decompression. Cargo Bay 04. Execute. Instantly the station screamed. Klaxons blared, red emergency lights bathed the corridor in blood, and a synthesized voice roared over the intercom. "Warning. Catastrophic decompression detected. All personnel. All personnel." Hesk vanished from the window, his cold satisfaction replaced by panic as he was consumed by the chaos of his own station. The high-pitched sonic whine in the cell stopped as the station diverted all non-essential power. Kale gasped, the psychic backlash leaving him trembling and sick. Vex, freed from the agony, was on its feet, its rage a palpable, vibrating aura. It looked at Kale, then at the main door. Kale, with the last of his strength, had done one more thing. He had unlocked their cage. "Now Vex," Kale choked, pointing. "Out." The door hissed open, not to a line of guards, but to an empty, flashing red corridor. The station-wide alert had sent everyone scrambling for safety. Vex didn't hesitate. It didn't go for Hesk. It went for Kale. With an impossible gentleness, it nudged Kale onto its back, a silent command. Kale clung to the warm, thick-pelted shoulder, and the world blurred. Vex moved like a phantom, a 400-kilo shadow flowing through the chaotic, empty station, guided by the psychic map in Kale's mind. Shuttle Bay small ship escape. They weren't just fleeing, they were a single, symbiotic entity executing a plan. They burst into Cargo Bay 04. It was a vacuum open to the void, but a small 2-man Firefly-class inspector ship was still docked, its cockpit lights on. Kale slid off Vex's back and hit the ramp switch. "Inside, Vex. Go." The Predator bounded up the ramp and into the co-pilot station, its form preternaturally calm. Kale sealed the hatch just as Hesk and a team of stunned security guards burst onto the gantry. Kale met Hesk's furious, disbelieving gaze through the cockpit glass. Kale just shook his head. He hit the undocking clamps and slammed the throttle. The ship shot from the bay, its engines a brilliant blue-white flare against the darkness. Kale felt Vex's mind press against his, no longer a scream of pain, but a quiet, profound wave of curiosity. He looked over. The apex predator, the untamable weapon, was sitting perfectly still, its burning ember eyes fixed on the star-dusted cosmos, finally free.